Hello, I want to introduce you to our second World Accessibility Day session featuring the wonderful Amy and Jaime from the Open LMS team. So I'm going to hand it over to them.
Great, thanks, Maddie. As Maddie mentioned, my name is Amy Tessitore, and we are here today to present for World Accessibility Day. So let's get our screen share queued up here. All right. There we are. All right, so hopefully in a couple seconds here, you'll be able to see my screen with our presentation. So I'd like to welcome you all for World Accessibility Awareness Day. On May 20th, 21, that is what we're focusing on today. So we'll be taking a look at a variety of different aspects of creating an accessible and inclusive environment. So my name is Amy Tessitore, and I'm Senior Manager of Engagement. And joining me today on the call is Jaime Aid, and she is the Customer Solutions Specialist here at eThink Education by Open LMS. And we'll both be speaking with you today. You'll get to hear a little bit from each of us, but that's just a little bit of a background on us and what we do here at eThink by Open LMS. So today we're going to cover a couple of topics. We're going to talk about accessibility in general terms and also in some in-depth terms. We're going to talk about what inclusion is, and you'll start to see why accessibility and inclusion, while they work together, are not the same thing. We'll talk about why each of those matter, and then we'll give you some base tips for creating inclusive and accessible courses. So as I mentioned, today's Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and the purpose of this day is to get everyone talking, thinking, and learning about digital access and inclusion. And the more than 1 billion people with disability impairments, and that's 1 billion people across the globe. So that means that approximately 15% of the world's population lives with a disability. You may or may not see those disabilities, but either way, our role here is to make sure that we're creating accessible and inclusive environments for people to learn and grow. What is accessibility? Accessibility is education, and it's designed to meet the needs of learners who have varying backgrounds, varying abilities, and various needs related to access, either physical access to where they're gaining their education or access to the content itself. So when we think about that and we talk about that in terms of what that means broadly, it's clear that accessibility is more than just putting in a wheelchair ramp or a power assist door or putting transcripts or captionings up in our courses. There's so much more involved in creating an accessible learning and teaching environment. So I'm going to kick it over to Jaime for a minute here, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more about why accessibility is important, why it matters, and why we're here focusing today.
Hello, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Jaime, and I work in customer solutions here. And I'm very proud to be part of today's events and presentations for a couple of reasons. One, I really enjoy the arena of accessibility and trying to give a broader basically sense and access to all things education-based for everyone. And I come to that from a very personal place. I have cerebral palsy, and I organize and run a group for adults with CP. So I have lots of people in my immediate community who have very varying types of abilities and disabilities surrounding visual impairments, hearing impairments, and orthopedic impairments. So making sure that the products that I help to promote and support enable everyone in my own community to access the information and have a great experience is super important. And as you know, in this digital time, just because we can see someone online does not actually mean that we may know anything about their particular situation or impairment. Most of you today, when I jumped on, probably had no idea that I am a card-carrying disabled American. So there you go. Just goes to show you that you just don't know. So it's important that we make everything as accessible as possible for everyone. And that really is giving opportunity for all learners, reducing any barrier that may exist for access and engagement, making sure that everyone can engage and interact with the material, and then reducing any negative perceptions that people may have around disability, trying to really just level the playing field, that all participants and all learners are equal in their experience. And then the fact that the more accessible things are, the more it benefits everyone. And as Amy gets deeper into the presentation, we will begin to show you that a lot of the enhancements and adaptations that center around accessibility inside of the software and the tools really is there to help everyone, including those who may have special needs.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And as Jamie mentioned, there are so many things to think about with accessibility and why it's important. And I really am glad that she talked about the fact that as we're working in a digital age and we're connecting using video conferencing, I think that it is creating a situation where we are even less aware of the different needs and the disabilities that someone may be working or living with each day. And so accessibility matters because, as Jamie mentioned, we want to create opportunity for everyone. And so when we create an accessible environment, the education opportunities exist for everyone. Accessible environments reduce barriers to access and engagement. And so that's more than just the physical barrier. So we're talking about more than just the obstacle, the barrier of getting into the building, but also barriers related to being able to access content and engage with other learners, our facilitators, and things like that. Accessibility is important too because it helps to reduce perceptions and negative perceptions surrounding disability. So when we create an accessible environment by default, we're not drawing attention to negative aspects of disability or creating a perception of negative aspects of disability. What we're creating is an inclusive environment. Accessibility benefits everyone. One thing to keep in mind, particularly here in the US, and as I'm sure it is the same around the world, those of us, people with disabilities, do not have to declare that disability. So if they're in a higher education institution or in the corporate world, individuals don't have to declare their disability. So when we create an accessible environment, that benefits everyone, including folks who have declared their disability, folks who don't want to declare their disability. And there are also many people around the world who are living with a disability that has yet to be diagnosed. Let me just, there we go. Now, what is inclusion? Inclusion is a bit different because inclusion is when we talk about creating the inclusive environment where there's equal access and opportunity. So accessibility makes sure that there's opportunity, and inclusion makes sure that there's both equal access and the opportunity. And we want to create that for everyone, everywhere that's possible. In education, inclusion means that we're reducing barriers that might prevent equitable use of digital content, teaching and learning activities, or assessment. So we have a lot of things here that we're kind of talking about. Some of the current challenges include that there, as we know, in the past year in particular, vast amounts of course content have been put up out there onto learning management systems. So there's a lot of course content, and that can make it difficult for an institution to understand where they currently stand with accessibility and inclusion and how to get to a more accessible and inclusive environment. It also means that we need to be more careful about ensuring that everything is mapped out and laid out in a way that makes it easy for our learners to access it. Another is on the educator side. There's the lack of awareness and understanding. So educators sometimes struggle with understanding the impact of accessibility and how to create more accessible content. So if we don't understand the impact of accessibility, it makes it really hard for us to know where to start and how to make that accessible environment. And then for learners, learners can very easily fall behind in an environment that's not accessible or inclusive. They can be blocked from accessing content, delayed in their courses due to the time involved in gaining that access, particularly access to alternative formats of content. So one of the first quotes or things we want to talk about here today is that our personal abilities often define our sense of what's normal. So what we on an everyday, daily basis are able to accomplish based on our personal abilities or disabilities defines kind of our sense of what's normal. And so here we have a post that was on Twitter. Nipun was invited to speak at the Smart City panel on accessibility. And when he arrived, there were no ramps to get onto the stage. And so again, we've invited someone to come and speak on accessibility and brought them to an environment that, because of our own perceptions and our own normal daily operating, we thought was perfectly fine, and it clearly was not. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that, everyone. All right. The other thing is that we disproportionately focus on observable impairments. So when we think about this, we're talking about we focus on those disabilities that we can see. People who have mobility impairments, maybe we see those more frequently. Someone who is visually impaired or hearing impaired, where we're able to see the assistive technology and devices that they're using. So we often want to build inclusive and accessible environments based on just those disabilities that we can see. However, when we look at all of the disabilities across the spectrum, physical and observable disabilities only make up 7% of the total disabilities that people are living with each day. So that means that there are another 93% of people out there living with a disability that you may not see very obviously on any given day. And that extends beyond the obvious visual and hearing impairments. Although we talk about those, and we will talk a little bit about those today, there are many other types of disabilities that we need to think about when we are creating inclusive environments. And so this graphic shows you different icons for different types of disabilities. There are many types of disabilities. And so when we are creating that accessible and inclusive environment, we need to remember that we are unlikely to see most of our learners' disabilities.
And even people with the same disability type may have varying ranges of where they excel and where they need assistance. So even within a particular category, you have a broad range of abilities and needs. So the important thing is never to assume.
Absolutely. And that's very important to know. And we'll talk a little bit too about some of what our perceptions about what we think disability looks like in a minute. And that will also, Jamie, that's a great point, because that will feed well into what we're going to talk about coming up. So this statistic here, each one of the dots represents 1 of 100 learners. And what the statistic says is that 1 in 5 learners is engaging in the learning environment with a disability. So they're living with a disability and also obtaining an education. So that's about 20% of our students that we need to be always thinking about. And I think that when we create an accessible environment, by default, we are saying all of our learners are equally important to us. All of our learners deserve and are entitled to an equitable experience. Another thing to think about is that there's significant comorbidity or coexisting disabilities. So oftentimes when someone is living with one disability, they're actually living with more than one. One great example is anxiety and depression. We often say that they are two friends who go hand in hand. Frequently, folks who are living with anxiety are also living with depression and vice versa. Additionally, anxiety and ADHD also go together. And so, as you can imagine, it is very challenging for some to live with even one of these disabilities, but to have two and they're combined, and now you're entering into an education into a learning atmosphere where accessibility isn't a priority, you are facing double the obstacles. And so we said it's easy to overlook people outside our zone of normal. And so we also want to talk about that in terms of what the perceptions are for what is normal and what we think disability looks like. This is just one example, and here we're looking at depression. So the media creates an idea around what depression looks like, a stigma associated with depression. Often you'll see images such as this where people look very sad or withdrawn, and we think that that's what depression will look like. But that's not always the case. Depression can look like this. Many times people living with depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, or chronic health considerations are not incapable of experiencing joy and happiness and other positive emotions. In fact, often people living with depression appear happy, outgoing, supportive, funny, or what we perceive as normal. And that means that we are more likely to overlook these disabilities. but it also means that we need to work on what our preconceived perceptions of disability are. So this brings us to why it's so important to design for accessibility. And so looking at the current standards, what do you have to do to meet those standards? And now those standards are different across the board. So different localities, different counties, different states, different regions, different countries have different standards. And so the first step is understanding what the base standards are where you live, and then understanding how you might exceed those. So just some very basic pieces that we're going to talk about here. The high color contrast, closed captioning in transcripts, the use of alternative text, and descriptive linking. So when we talk about high contrast color, this improves the visibility of things for everyone. And so colors next to each other on a color wheel are low contrast, and colors across from one another are high contrast colors. Now, one of the things I'll point out is that when you look at this color wheel, red and green are opposite each other, which makes them high contrast colors. However, keeping in mind learners or folks that we're working with who may be colorblind, if you're using red on green or red to emphasize importance, someone who is red-green colorblind is not going to be able to see that color, get or understand that you're using red or see that you're using red as important. If red and green are paired together, they won't be able to see any of the text there. So keep those things in mind. But when you are choosing colors, you do want to choose some high contrast colors. When we talk about closed captioning in transcripts, I'm sure that you have all heard about this before. This is one of the go-tos whenever we talk about accessibility. Closed captioning in transcripts is one of the first things that gets mentioned. So closed captioning plays on the screen with the video, and that's what sets it apart from transcripts. Transcripts are in a separate document with the exact dialogue from the audio or video recording. But another way that you might use a transcript is if you've presented a graphic, such as an infographic or a table, that may need more description than you can give an alternative text, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These are not an option, but a requirement. And some options for closed captioning, if you are looking for a solution, Chrome has added live captioning to the browser, so you're able to get some live captioning there. Google Meet has a closed captioning feature where if you turn it on, the meet that you're in will be live captioned for you. And YouTube has some auto captioning available as well. When you're creating a transcript, one of our favorite things to do, for instance, if we're doing a session like this and want to create a transcript, is we run Microsoft Word with live subtitling on the side, and everything that we're saying is automatically transcribed into a Word document that we can then clean up later. So these are some very inexpensive and easy ways to start on your way for creating closed captioning and transcripts.
And Amy, just as a side note, for our global digital community as it is now, we have many more people participating in our programs who may also have our main language as a second language. So not only do those transcripts and closed captioning help and support those who may be hearing impaired, but it also supports those who may need to look at the content later and use any sort of translation for their native language.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So now we'll talk about alternative text. So we use alternative text as a way of telling to show something. So if I am unable to see images, I'm not going to be able to pull out the importance of what's happening in that image. And if it's something that's critical to my learning, I need to have a description. So alternative text should be concise but descriptive. So you're talking no more than about 140 to 150 total characters in an alternative text description. And you want to keep it short but concise. Include link destinations. So if something is going to open in a new window, make sure that you say that. And then create a separate transcript, as I mentioned, for things like tables and infographics. So when I'm putting up a table where there is lots of data that I need my learners to have access to and do something with, I need to give a full description of what that is, so that they're able to have the same experience as someone who's able to see and use the table. Same thing goes for infographics. Some things to avoid when it comes to alternative text. You don't need to write image of before you put on the text. Screen readers will automatically let a user know that that's an image, so you don't need to tell them again. You also don't need to include descriptions of decorative images. So if something is purely decorative it has absolutely no impact on a learner's learning, then you don't need to give a description for that. And also make sure you don't go over 140 to 150 characters. Most platforms are now set up to limit the number of characters you can put in alt text, but if it's not, do be mindful of that. Descriptive linking. So screen readers read every character in a URL. So if you even look at the URL you use to access this presentation today, you can imagine how frustrating it would be to have a screen reader read out each and every one of those characters. However, if you make the link descriptive, for example, if your descriptive said World Accessibility Awareness Webinar, then that helps to provide context about what the URL is and make it much easier for users using a screen reader to navigate that URL. It also improves keyboard navigation as a learner tabs across and hits that URL. The description will be read. They'll be notified that that is a URL with the description, and they can go from there. When we're talking about descriptive links, ultimately our goal is that the learner can determine the purpose of each link from the link text alone. They know where they're going, they know why they're going there, and where they'll end up. So when we talk about inclusive design, we need to understand that when we're designing for inclusion, the purpose is to reduce the burdens on students. We also want to promote self-effective learning, and we can do that through inclusive design. One last point here, when we are using inclusive design and creating and designing for inclusion, we ensure an appropriate learning environment for all learners, regardless of the ways in which they need or would prefer to access that content. And so here's just a picture of what our day-to-day kind of might look like in our head. So our life basically comes down to a series of daily decisions, and there are hundreds of them that we make each day. And we all do this. So when we're creating learning environments, how do we reduce the burden of decision-making for others? We don't want people to have to come into our courses and make lots of decisions in order to just access the content. And so our goal here is to reduce that burden of decision-making for our learners so that when they come in, they are able to just get down to learning. So one of the ways we do that is we make it easy for learners to find things and to have access to things. And so here we have a graphic, an image of back pain relief, and it's on the very bottom shelf at a grocery store or a market. Now, if I'm suffering from back pain, the last thing I want to do is bend all the way over to be able to get the medicine that's going to help me. Same idea here when it comes to education. We want to make sure that everything is within reach for our learners and that it's easy for them to find things. We also want to clearly communicate. And so here, it might be a little hard to see just based off of the type of image, but clearly the sign above this, this payment station says credit card only, debit card only. So is it one or the other? But then the actual readout, the digital readout says cash only. Not well communicated. So it's the same thing when we're creating an inclusive learning environment. We want to clearly communicate everything that a learner needs to know to easily access and navigate our courses and the content. So there are 4 characteristics to keep in mind when we are creating an accessible and inclusive learning environment. Those 4 are context, compassion, clarity, and consistency. And let's look at what each of those actually means. So context is the information between the information. And here we've used the analogy of cooking. So this is the, this tastes good starter kit here. We've got some salt, some fresh garlic, some herbs, maybe butter, heavy cream. And so these ingredients on their own are fine. Maybe they're not going to wow us. They're not really overpowering. But when we put them all together, we create a dish. We create something that we really enjoy and we can get behind, and everything complements one another. So when we talk about cooking, it's when we bring all of these things together. That's kind of the context. It's the information between the information. Each of these pieces, each of these ingredients is designed to bring out aspects of something else to make them clearer. They bring out what's already there. So here we have some more things to kind of bring this point home. And so These ingredients on their own are not necessarily very overwhelming, but no one's going to sit down and eat, a pat of butter or a half of lemon. Just like no one's going to come into your course and just access one tiny piece of something and be able to walk away with something great. That's not how things happen. And so when we are making sure that we are providing context in our course, each of the ingredients in our course fits with other ingredients in the course. And our learners start to understand that by digesting each of those pieces, each bit of content, each ingredient, in the end, they will come out with a very specific, well-rounded understanding of concepts and be able to meet those end goals. Another point here for context, and so other terms outside of food, if recipes and cooking is not your analogy, context is the information that links other information together and gives it meaning. So even when things have surface level similarities, here we can see that we have geometric shapes, we can provide additional information that ties it all together into a meaningful whole. And so apart, we have shapes that look mildly related, but the context is when we bring them together, we can create a whole. Ways that we're able to bring context into our teaching and learning practice are by chunking, so breaking down very complex items into smaller pieces. And here we have a great example. We have some children building with some mega blocks, which are kind of like Lego blocks in the background here. And so we can break down really complex items into individual pieces that the learner can then assemble to find the more and to understand the more complex piece behind things. Reencoding is another way that we can help to provide context. And this is how we help learners to put those pieces back together. So we've broken everything down, we've chunked it into individual smaller pieces. Reencoding is when we help the learners to put the pieces together to come to the end goal, which is the more complex understanding of what we're talking about. One of the things we wanted to talk about today is the use of apps and technology when it comes to accessibility. And so when we are thinking about context, this is a pretty interesting app. It's called Seeing AI. And Seeing AI is an artificial intelligence app developed by Microsoft. And it's for the iOS system, so only if you have an iPhone or something like that. But the app uses the device camera to identify people and objects in scanned images or in images that you take. And then the app audibly describes those objects for people with visual impairment. So let's look at what that actually looks like. So you can see we're opening the app here.
Processing.
And there we are. And so after looking at the image, the software processes the image and it gives us a description. So it tells us what the scene is, probably a person and a couple of children sitting on a couch with a laptop. The person description is 2 people detected, 25-year-old woman with black hair looking natural, and a 6-year-old girl with black hair looking happy. And we bring this up because it's important to know that many of our learners who are trying to access our content are also trying to do so by bringing in their own apps, things that work for them and that are reliable for them. And this is one example of an app that helps to provide context for images and surroundings as someone with a visual impairment is navigating the world around them. Captions are context. So when we provide captions on images, not just alt text, we are providing context. So here we have an image of 2 ladies taking a selfie. But here we can see that the description would be 2 young Black women taking a selfie with a smartphone. And so it's important to know because members of the Millennial and Gen Z generations often use smartphones to save, document, and share their personal experiences with others. And these practices often include selfies, which are photos of themselves, and they're taken at places of interest. And so these photos help to create meaning. They're a meaningful attachment to that memory or that place. But without context and without captioning, we might not really know what's happening in the image. This is a pretty basic image, but there are many times that we can look at an image. I may see the image one way, you may see it another. And so each of us is picking out something different that we perceive to be important in that image. And this is why captions matter. Captions provide context about why that image is important. Another step here in providing context is summarizing. So letting your learners know where we have been. So at the end of any type of major lesson or content chunk, it's important to offer a summary so that we talk about where we've been so we can move on. And then, filling in the gaps helps everyone. So when we fill in the gaps at the end and in our summary, that does help everyone. The next of our 4 tenets here, as far as creating an accessible and inclusive environment, is compassion. And part of compassion is making yourself more accessible. So we can focus all we want on video and audio and websites, but when we talk about making education more accessible, we as the facilitator, whether we're a trainer or we're a teacher, we need to be more accessible. So making ourselves available for our learners helps promote compassion. It allows us to understand our learners and where they're coming from, where they need to go, and how we might create a better learning experience for them. Language is important, and this is a big part of compassion. It's not just what you say, it is really also how you say it. So we need to reframe our wording, reframe our language. So this might be the way that you have often heard people with disabilities referred to: a disabled person, a blind person, a deaf person. We're qualifying each of these people based on a disability that they have been diagnosed with. Let's reframe that. Let's start talking about a person with a disability, a person who is blind. They are a person first who is living with a disability. Reframing your language promotes compassion, understanding, and inclusion in your environment. We talked earlier about being easy to overlook people outside our zone of normal. And so here's a perfect example. Here we're giving a webinar. We have a speaker. You can turn your speakers up as loud as you want. But when I'm in a classroom or I'm in a convention center, I can't count the number of times I've heard someone say, "I don't need a microphone." And the key word there is, I know that I'm loud enough for me to hear myself. But don't make someone out themselves. Like, you're not considering that someone else may not be able to hear you. "I don't need a microphone" is a very good example of how we're overlooking people outside our zone of normal. I know that I can be loud, but that doesn't mean that someone with a hearing impairment is able to hear me, even though I think I'm loud. Also important to remember, always turn your face to people when you're speaking. Make sure that people are able to see your face. And just as an added bonus, research shows that there's better engagement and retention of learning when instructors, facilitators, or teachers use a microphone, even in smaller classes. Masking. So masking is something you need to be aware of if you are working on being compassionate. And so masking is how neurodivergent people try to comfort neurotypical people. And so many neurodivergent people mask in front of neurotypical people, meaning that they try to appear what we consider normal. They may mask to the point where it could be difficult for a neurotypical person to see an impairment, since the stereotypical markers are not present of what we think are stereotypical of a specific disability. And so having learned to perform and navigate in situations that accommodate neurotypical people by default, that's an exhausting process to spend the day pretending that you do not have a disability. So part of being compassionate and creating a compassionate environment is making sure that you are inclusive. No one feels like they have to mask their disability around you or in your learning environment. And so also, when we're being compassionate, we're providing multiple pathways to the same destination. So if COVID has proven anything, it's that we can successfully work remotely, even if it's not preferred by every instructor. But it also shows that we can provide multiple pathways to the same destination. And so you can provide those pathways to ensure that students with mobility impairments, financial burdens, or who are feeling really overwhelmed have an opportunity to engage in that content. One of the things we've learned over this past year is that when we do offer online courses and the option to meet people via web conferencing, we are making sure that there is an opportunity. There are multiple pathways for learners to engage both with us and each other, because perhaps they have a financial burden, they can't make it to campus, they don't have gas money, they can still attend if they're on a web conference. Or perhaps someone is living with disability, with anxiety or depression, and getting to school on that particular day or getting to work on that particular day would create an overwhelming burden for them. Allowing people to connect remotely helps to give multiple pathways and reduce some of those barriers. Creating those multiple pathways helps everyone, even when we're not talking about disability. Multiple pathways really does help everyone. Clarity is the next tenet we'll talk about. And so here we say it's like Marie Kondo, but for your computer. So Marie Kondo is a television personality who helps people to organize their physical spaces in their homes. And so when we talk about clarity, we're talking about keeping a well-organized course or online learning space, or even a physical space. When things are very organized, it's easy for learners to gain access to the things they need. And part of that is simplicity. You only have what you need and nothing more. Yes, we want to throw all these resources at people, but we don't need to. Again, we're back to a food analogy. If we're cooking a meal, we take out the ingredients we need. We don't take out everything in the refrigerator or the spice rack. We're not bringing the whole kitchen with us, just what we need. This prevents us from creating an overwhelming experience for learners who are getting too much content and information at once. And so there are lots of ways to accomplish this. If you're using a learning management system, you may want to just show one topic at a time or use a collapsed topic format. You might want to build content into something that's designed to house lots of content, so like a repository. Two of my favorites are the H5P interactive book and using the book in any Moodle-based LMS. Those are great ways to put lots of content in one place, so just one thing is coming up on that course page. Keeping it simple, giving our learners only what they need, not everything we know. Another piece for clarity is giving direction. When we give directions, this is where clarity meets context. So context was the why, and clarity is here are the things. The direction is how do we bring those two together? So some examples as it relates to accessibility would be emailing directions to someone for how to visit your office. If a learner wants to meet with you or a colleague wants to meet with you, you should email them some directions to visit your office, and then think about things that might need to be considered. For example, is your office on a high level where someone will need to take an elevator? Did you include how to reach that elevator? Are you on the garden level floor? Someone can come straight into your office. Are there other navigational considerations for someone to access you or the content? Make sure that when you're giving directions, you are clear and concise, and you are helping learners to access either the physical space or the actual resources. And then we talk about consistency. So when we're consistent and we create a consistent learning environment, our learners are not coming in and having to relearn where to find things. They're not coming in each week and something new is happening, so they're having to adjust to that and learn the new routine. So when we're consistent, this is our learners know where to go and what to do when they get there. And so here's an example. You may or may not be able to pick out the inconsistency here, but here is a banister, some rails as we come down some stairs here, and everything looks pretty consistent until it's not. And you can see that we have a little arrow popping in from the bottom of the screen to show that one of the balusters is not. And so this can be what it looks like for someone who's in a learning environment and we've been doing something one way for several weeks, and all of a sudden everything is different. And so that can create problems for learning. Routines are a part of consistency, and they all feed back up into clarity and consistency. And routines are habits and systems. So if we're going to do something in the same way each week, or we're encouraging our learners to approach something from certain directions or to link content in a certain way, those are routines. Routines help people to feel comfortable in the environment and are very important as we talk about accessibility and inclusion. And weekly reminders. So weekly reminders help with the consistency piece. Do a weekly summary email or something along those lines where you just post either in the beginning of the week or the end of the week some weekly reminders. It's a little extra work for you if you're the person presenting the content, either a teacher, facilitator, trainer, but it's very beneficial to those who are learning from you. It's helpful in general, but it's also a good reset for neurodivergent students, such as students who have ADHD and anxiety in particular. Those students living with those types of disabilities, or learners or colleagues living with those disabilities, weekly reminders can help reset and reorganize. Some early data from COVID teaching indicates that students and learners really do appreciate frequent communication from their facilitators and teachers. And it made them feel like their instructor cared more about them when that instructor was putting out those more frequent communication. Now, we're not overdoing it. There needs to be some purpose behind that communication, but just know that things like weekly reminders really do make learners feel like you're invested in them and what they're doing. Ultimately, when you're creating your environment, the question you need to ask yourself is, what is the goal? Is the goal to see who sinks or swims, so who is able to rise to the top and who fails? Or is the goal to ensure that you are creating an environment where any learner has the opportunity to be successful? And so I hope it's the latter. And if it is, then let he who has not received a reminder from their department chair cast the first stone, right? So we have all been there where we need a little reminder or a nudge on something. Do the same in your learning environment. Create an environment where anyone has the opportunity to learn and achieve. So how do we do this? How do we design for inclusion? We talked a little bit about designing for accessibility. Let's talk a little bit about designing for inclusion. And that's going to include universal design for learning. So universal design for learning is a framework, and it's there to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all. And so when we think about what that means, it's really that it's a research-based approach to creating and designing courses to optimize teaching and learning to meet the needs of all learners. So there are different needs that we have, even based on day-to-day, content to content, but essentially the goal for universal design for learning is that whenever you arrive in the learning space, your need for that in that moment will be met. UDL guidelines are laid out according to 3 principles, and those principles are engagement, representation, and action and expression. And each principle is tied to a guideline to address access, build, internalize, and the goal of that particular principle. So engagement is effective networks. So that's the why of learning. Why are we doing this? And I'm sure you have all worked with someone or taught someone who you really was not motivated. They didn't understand why they had to learn this. And so the engagement piece here stimulates that interest and the motivation for learning. So when you're designing, using universal design for learning, and you're under the principle of engagement, you're creating an environment where someone's intrinsically motivated. You're starting to spark that intrinsic motivation for learning. Representation is when we provide multiple means for someone. So we present information and content in different ways so that people are able to access that content in different ways. And so it guides us in tailoring content for learners, specifically for those who are both knowledgeable and resourceful. And ultimately, through engagement, we hope to create a learner who is knowledgeable and resourceful. Representation helps to direct us to present content in a variety of different ways. And so that might look like providing a video to accompany a text-based resource, or providing images, text and audio for a single concept or activity. And it essentially just means you're going to present that content in more than one way. So learners have multiple ways to access that content. And then action and expression. So this is the how of learning. And we want to provide multiple means for learners to show us how they learned. And so we can differentiate the way that students can express what they know. And what this means is that we are creating an environment where someone is not beholden. They don't have to show us what they know with one specific assessment. I know that we don't always have that choice, but as we go along the way throughout our courses, we might. And that may mean you can elect to take a quiz or write a paper or submit an oral presentation, a video of yourself presenting the content to me. And so that's what the action and expression piece is. Action and expression is really specific to goal-oriented learners. and it does guide us in creating differentiated ways for those learners to show us what they know. If we follow the UDL principles as we're designing, ultimately, we will create an engaged learner who is resourceful and who becomes goal-oriented as well. And so in order to accomplish both accessibility and inclusive design, we need to rethink how we design courses. And so we see here that learning outcomes are linked to assessments, which link to learning activities, which are part of content. And this really is a circle here. Each of these is deeply interwoven into the next. And so when we talk about rethinking how we design assessment, we may look at designing assessment early on before we even design the content. This is called backwards by design. I won't talk a lot about backwards by design, but it's a design process that I think is important to know about. But we rethink how we design assessment and making sure that we are getting down to the how of learning. Does our assessment make sure that the how of learning is captured? So how did my learner gather this information, and what do they know, and how can they tell it to me? And so this means that we incorporate multiple means of expression in assessments, and we choose course design decisions that make it easy to mitigate student anxiety regarding assessment. So we know that students and learners and even people in the workplace have tremendous anxiety surrounding assessment. And so when we create and we design assessments in a way that we are able to give the learner an opportunity to show us what they know, we help to reduce that anxiety. We also want to make sure we build in feedback in those assessments. So no matter what the assessment is, there should be ample time for feedback, and that feedback should be easy to access. We also want to offer students choice regarding assignments, communication, and content delivery. So we really can do that. We can make sure that people have access to a variety of different things that they can do. When we talk about learning activities, so now we're talking about bringing in that engagement piece as we create our learning activities. So we're going to incorporate a variety of learning activities. So no more making our online course areas a document repository. Instead of putting up lots of PDFs, we're going to use a variety of learning activities. And the same goes in the physical space. We want to incorporate learner interaction and collaboration into the course, and encourage student self-regulation and personal coping skills. So in order to do that, we're also going to be incorporating learner choice here. And so when we have a variety of learning activities, we can give our learners choices about which of those they engage in order to get involved in those learning activities. So as we design learning activities, we keep that in mind. And then finally, we need to rethink how we design content. And so when we are building content, we're in the representation phase, representation principle of UDL. And that means that we're ensuring all our course materials are accessible to all learners. So no matter what the learner needs to access course materials, they can do so. We have created that environment. We also present the main course concepts in more than one format. So maybe we've made an instructional video to present all of those main course concepts. When we are ensuring representation and designing that content, we also offer other ways, other formats that we're going to get that information out there in. We also want to offer opportunities to encourage student agency. We want students to feel like they have agency in our course. They can take control of their learning. They can come to us if they need to talk to us. They can choose the paths that they know will be most effective for them. And we also want to plan ways to informally gauge student understanding of course concepts. We talked about assessment a couple slides ago. This is how do we informally and along the way, formative type of assessment, gauge our student understanding of course concepts. If we're presenting them in multiple different ways, we may find that there is a way that doesn't seem to work well for most people and some things that work better. So that can also help us to come back and revise that content. And now I'm going to kick it over to Jaime, because the next thing here we want to talk about is we've talked about all of these things that you need to do in order to create courses and make an inclusive environment. But what do you do if you already created the environment and you need some help kind of understanding what's going on in there? So Jaime, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. So within Open LMS, we do have access to a program that we call Ally. Ally provides institutions with a way to basically check their environments as they are now and to anticipate and improve the experience of students by helping them take control of the course content. And this happens on 3 levels. For the student, they have automated accessible versions of the content. For the educator, there is instructor feedback and some warnings to indicate where you could improve or amend your content. And last but certainly not least, for the institution, it does provide institutional reporting, gauging both the engagement of the students and the educator, and helping you to identify areas where you are performing quite strongly or areas where you may need additional assistance or revision. And Amy, would you mind moving the slide for me? Thank you so much. So to prove that Ally is not just a concept, but something that is well trusted and in use, it's important to know that 800 institutions around the world are currently using Ally to assist them in creating better, more inclusive content and experiences. And over 62 million courses have been processed using the Ally format, and over 2 billion content items have been processed, which I think is just amazing. And this is since 2017, so not all that long ago when Ally first began. These are the stats for what we've been able to accomplish in helping to give tools to both educators and administrators to guide them in moving forward with their existing content, but also proving that they can basically make their experiences more inclusive without recreating the wheel and just adapting what they already have into a better, more inclusive format. And creating more inclusive learning environments for all is really the goal of Ally. So if that's something that you have interest in, we have upcoming workshops and programs and also lots of experts here within Open LMS to assist you in using those tools and many others. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Jamie. So yes, as Jamie mentioned, we have many experts on staff with Ally. So if you ever have questions, be sure to reach out to us. And we are coming up here. We're now at the very end of our presentation. But if you are interested in learning more and really want to dive into creating an inclusive and accessible course environment, we invite you to join us for our Accessible and Inclusive Course Design course, which will be starting on June 2nd. And in that course, we'll be going over the fundamental aspects of inclusive and accessible design. And we'll also be getting into information about assistive technology, assessment considerations, differentiations. We'll dive deep on UDL and some others. So if you are interested in that, you can register down here. There's the link there, the bit.ly link. You can also visit the eThink Academy by Open LMS webpage for more information on that. And we are here right at the end now. So if there were any questions that Maddie found in any of the chats that she would like us to answer, we'll try to do that now. And if
I did not see any questions come through, but if anyone has them, please let us know. And you can also get in touch with our team at contact@openlms.net if you have any other follow-up questions, or you can drop one in here, leave us a comment on our Facebook page. Lots of ways to reach us, ask us a question on Twitter. We're here to help you answer your questions. But it doesn't look like anyone has any. So I just want to thank our 2 wonderful speakers today for presenting on the topic of accessibility, and let everyone know that, this is part of our work on Global Accessibility Day and bringing awareness, but this is just the start. So we encourage everyone to dive further into accessibility and share this with your colleagues, friends, or one of our other upcoming sessions today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.